The morning air over Los Angeles carried that mix of heat and smog that stuck to your skin before the day even began. On a stretch of busy boulevard lined with fast food joints, half-empty strip malls and banners boasting of holiday discounts, one car dealership gleamed brighter than the rest. Shiny glass windows reflected the rising sun, and rows of spotless vehicles stood at attention, their polished chrome catching the light like knives. From the outside, it was a picture of success. Sleek, clean, efficient. Inside, though, the place was more like a stage, where unseen tensions played out every day. The showroom smelled of leather and new rubber, but beneath that lay an edge of anxiety. Managers barked orders about quotas. Salesmen leaned too close to their customers, pasting on smiles that never touched their eyes. This was the kind of place where everyone wanted something, where pressure stacked on top of pressure, and no one left without feeling like they'd been sized up. The man who ran it all had the presence of someone who believed he owned not just the floor beneath his shoes, but the people who worked on it too. He walked with sharp steps, shoulders back, jaw tight, always in motion. His staff watched him with the kind of nervous attention that comes when you're not sure if today you'll get praise or be torn apart in front of everyone. To him, cars weren't just machines. They were trophies, markers of status, and most of all, leverage. He didn't sell dreams. He sold control, and control was what he lived for. On the surface, the workers' lives seemed ordinary enough. Salesmen compared notes about commissions, shared gossip over stale coffee in the break room, and checked their phones under the desk when the boss wasn't looking. But under the ordinary routines were fractures. Some had debts piling higher than their paychecks. Some drank too much after hours, able to shake the weight of failed deals. Others hid the resentment they felt toward their manager, biting their tongues so hard it nearly bled. They all needed the job, and he knew it. That need gave him power, and power was what kept the whole fragile thing standing. Customers came and went in a steady stream. Families walked in holding their kids' hands. Couples argued in hushed voices about monthly payments, and college students tried to talk their way into financing they couldn't afford. The dealership had an energy that buzzed constantly. Money, desperation, pride, and lies all hanging in the air like humidity. For outsiders, it looked like any other dealership. For those inside, it was a place where one wrong step could cost you everything. The manager's eyes missed nothing. He caught the way a customer hesitated, the way a salesman fumbled his words, the way a receptionist let her phone ring one beat too long. He thrived on control, on making people smaller so he could feel larger. To him, authority wasn't just part of the job. It was who he was. He carried it like armor, using it to shield himself from doubt. And if anyone dared to challenge it, he shut them down fast. The staff told themselves this was just business, just work. But beneath the daily grind lay a darker truth, that a place built on intimidation, where every glance and word carried weight, was bound to crack sooner or later. They felt it, even if they didn't say it. Something in the air was shifting, though no one could put their finger on what it was. Out on the lot, the cars gleamed as if nothing could touch them. Engines hummed, tires waited for the road, and the glass walls shimmered with morning light. But inside those walls, pride, greed, and fear brewed together like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. The dealership seemed unshakable, a monument to wealth and success. Yet the truth was that it was fragile, built on the ego of one man and the silence of many. And into this world, on a day that seemed no different from the rest, would walk someone who didn't fit into the rules of the place, someone whose presence alone would challenge everything the manager believed about control and power. No one inside could know it yet, but their normal routines, their rehearsed smiles, and even their fragile sense of safety were about to be torn apart. The heat of late afternoon seemed to trap itself in the glass walls of the dealership, making everything inside feel heavier, tighter, more suffocating. Phones rang non-stop, deals stalled, voices rose and fell in forced politeness. The manager's presence hung over it all like a shadow. His sharp gaze cutting through anyone who dared fall short. By now, his staff had grown used to the way he shifted moods without warning, 1 minute laughing with a customer, the next slamming his fist against a desk because a signature was missing on paperwork. It was a rhythm everyone had learned to survive under, but it wore them down, slow and steady, leaving behind cracks no one dared admit to. Money was always the main pressure. Sales targets weren't just numbers, they were demands, carved into the air like commandments. The higher-ups wanted bigger profits each month, and the manager made it clear he wouldn't take excuses. He spoke often about loyalty, about dedication, but what he meant was submission. His authority wasn't up for debate, and he reminded them of that in ways both loud and quiet. A public scolding for one, a subtle threat for another, a reminder that plenty of people were lined up outside, desperate for a job. Some of the salesmen began whispering among themselves when the manager wasn't in earshot. They knew his temper, knew the way he could make or break someone's career in a single afternoon. But what they didn't say out loud was the truth that lived in their gut. None of them really trusted him. He wasn't just a boss. He was a gatekeeper to survival, and survival meant tolerating whatever humiliation he decided to throw their way. The weight of financial struggles pressed harder on them than anyone outside could see. One salesman had been dodging collection calls for months, his car already marked for repossession. Another hid his gambling problem, a habit he swore he'd quit every time he lost another paycheck to it. The receptionist, young and worn thin from double shifts, kept showing up with dark circles under her eyes, but no one asked questions. Everyone had their secrets, and everyone needed this job too badly to let those secrets slip. The manager, though, thrived on sensing weakness. He watched for it, exploited it, twisted it to remind them he was in charge. He wasn't just selling cars, he was selling the illusion of control, both to the customers who drove off the lot and the workers who kept the place running. And when someone threatened that illusion, he grew restless, paranoid. It was during this climate of tension that whispers of change began to surface, though no one could yet see where it was coming from. A rumor passed through the staff one evening that the dealership had recently changed ownership. No one had the full story, just bits and pieces, a merger, maybe, or a buyout. The manager brushed it off when asked, insisting it was business as usual, but the way his jaw clenched betrayed him. Control meant everything to him, and even the hint that someone else had authority over his domain was enough to put him on edge. His paranoia started showing in small ways. He prowled the floor more aggressively, double-checking paperwork himself, nitpicking things he used to overlook. He snapped at the receptionist for letting someone wait too long, lectured a salesman in front of customers for not reading the room, and docked another's commission after claiming a discount had been applied without approval. To the staff, it felt like punishment without cause, but none of them pushed back. The pressure extended beyond the walls of the dealership. The economy outside was shifting, the cost of living climbing faster than wages. Customers were harder to convince. Their credit histories were weighed down with missed payments and defaults. Deals dragged on, approvals stalled, and more often than not, families left empty-handed. Every failed sale was a reminder that their own paychecks were shrinking, and every shrinking paycheck brought them closer to desperation. It was in this atmosphere of unease that the incident began to take shape. On the surface, it seemed like just another day, another potential customer walking in. But this wasn't just anyone. It was someone who carried presence the way others carried weight. Tall, laid back in posture but sharp in the eyes. A man who didn't need to prove who he was because the world already knew. He came with no entourage, no loud announcement, just quiet confidence that filled the room the second he stepped inside. The staff noticed first, whispering to each other, half stunned, half excited. They knew who he was, even if they tried to act casual about it. But the manager didn't. He saw only what he wanted to see. Another customer dressed in a way that didn't fit his polished expectations. Someone who looked too relaxed, too casual to be taken seriously. To him, this wasn't a VIP. It was a nuisance. That was the first spark. The moment where two worlds brushed against each other with enough friction to start a fire. The staff's whispers built into nervous energy, eyes darting between the manager and the man who had walked in. Everyone sensed it, the collision that was about to unfold. But no one dared to interfere. Beneath the surface, the manager's insecurities were bubbling. The whispers about new ownership hadn't left his mind, and the thought that he might not be the ultimate authority anymore gnawed at him. Every day he told himself he was untouchable, that this place was his kingdom. But the truth was slipping, and he could feel it. So when he saw someone walk in who didn't play by his rules, didn't bend to his presence, it struck a nerve that had already been frayed raw. The tension carried through the showroom like static. The staff avoided eye contact, unsure whether to step in or stay quiet. The man who had walked in didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention. He simply looked around, slow and curious, as if testing the weight of the place. And the manager, seeing his control threatened by the smallest act of indifference, felt his grip slipping. But this was more than just one man against another. It was the breaking point of weeks of paranoia, months of financial stress, and years of control games that left everyone on edge. It was the collision of pride and power, of someone who built his identity on dominance, and someone who carried power without ever needing to prove it. And it wasn't just the manager whose life was shifting. For the staff, the thought of someone else taking ownership, someone with enough wealth and influence to alter everything, sparked a mix of hope and fear. Hope that maybe the weight of their manager's control could be lifted. Fear that change might sweep them out altogether. Every look, every word, every unspoken thought in that room built towards something inevitable. A confrontation was coming, one that would expose more than just arrogance. It would peel back the thin layer of order that had held the place together and show the raw desperation underneath. The stage was set. The storm was gathering. The fragile world inside those glass wobblies. All's was about to crack, and once it did, no one in the building would walk away unchanged. The showroom buzzed with the hum of idle engines, the tap of heels across polished tile, and the low drone of sales pitches circling the air like gnats. But beneath that normal noise, there was something sharper, heavier, as if everyone could sense the fragile line that was about to snap. The man who had walked in, calm, unhurried, wearing confidence like a second skin, moved slowly between the rows of gleaming cars. His fingers brushed the cold steel of a hood, his eyes scanning the room with the relaxed curiosity of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. The manager watched him from behind the glass of his office. Every second the man lingered seemed like an insult. Customers were supposed to be anxious, needy, and easy to read, but this one carried himself with a weight that unsettled the manager, though he couldn't put his finger on why. All he saw was someone dressed too casually for the showroom, someone who looked like he didn't belong in a place where money and status were the real currency. He stormed out of his office, his shoes hitting the tile hard enough to draw eyes. The staff froze where they stood. They knew that look, that hard set of the jaw that meant he'd already decided how this would end. His voice sliced through the air, sharp and mocking, as he demanded to know what the man thought he was doing. The room shifted instantly. The salesmen lowered their gazes, trying to appear invisible. The receptionist stilled with her hand on the phone, afraid that even the sound of a dial tone might spark the fire further. No one breathed too loudly. The man, though, didn't flinch. He just looked at the manager with a steady calm, his eyes neither hostile nor submissive, just steady, as if nothing here could rattle him. That look enraged the manager more than words could have. He needed control, needed submission, and the man's calm denial of it cut straight into his pride. He raised his voice, his words turning from sharp questions to insults, each syllable dripping with the need to humiliate. He called him out for his clothes, mocked his presence, and sneered at the way he was taking up space. Still, the man didn't react. No raised voice, no defense, just a faint, almost amused smile, like he knew something the rest of the room didn't. That smile set the manager off. His voice rose until it filled every inch of the showroom, until the glass walls themselves seemed to tremble with it. He shouted for him to get out, spit flying with the force of it, veins pulsing in his neck. The staff stood frozen in horror. Some recognized who was standing before them. They knew the face, the voice, the presence. They wanted to speak up, to warn the manager, but fear sealed their mouths shut. Speaking out meant drawing fire onto themselves, and none of them had the courage for that. The man finally moved, slow and deliberate. He tilted his head, looked at the manager as if weighing him, then turned his eyes to the staff who couldn't meet his gaze. He didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as though confirming something only he understood, and turned to walk toward the door. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was dread. The manager stood at the center of it all, a chest heaving, sweat beading along his hairline. For a brief second he felt victorious, convinced he had reasserted his control, reminded everyone who the king of this floor was. But that sense of victory was hollow. The eyes of his staff told him everything. Fear, yes, but also something else. Pity. And pity to him was poison. The man reached the door, paused with one hand on the handle, and looked back. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't wounded. It was quiet, cold, final. A look that told the room this wasn't over. And then he left. The aftermath was suffocating. The showroom filled with the sound of nervous shifting, papers rustling, phones ringing again as if trying to erase what had just happened. But nothing erased it. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed wasn't just another outburst. It was the moment something irreversible had been set in motion. The manager stormed back into his office, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. He tried to shake the unease gnawing at him, tried to convince himself he had done the right thing, that no one would dare question him after that. But deep down, beneath the armor of arrogance, he felt it, that he had crossed a line. The staff whispered when he couldn't hear. Their voices carried fear and disbelief. "He doesn't know who that was," one muttered under his breath. "God help him when he finds out." Another nodded, eyes wide, already imagining the fallout. Outside, the man walked away from the glass walls without hurry. His posture never changed, his calm never wavered. But his silence carried more weight than anger ever could. The dealership behind him still buzzed, still clung to its fragile order, but the foundation had cracked. The crime wasn't blood, wasn't violence, not yet. It was pride weaponized, dignity stripped, respect denied. It was the act of a man so consumed by control that he couldn't see he had just destroyed his own. And in that moment, with the echo of his own shouting still ringing in his ears, the manager had no idea he had committed the gravest mistake of his life, humiliating the very man who now owned everything he thought was his. The chaos wasn't loud at first. It lived in silence, in the nervous glances, in the quiet dread of those who knew more than their boss did. But chaos has a way of spreading, of gathering force, and before long, the storm that had only just begun would break wide open. The air inside the dealership felt different the next morning, as if the entire building knew what had happened and was bracing itself for what was to come. The staff moved more slowly, quieter, their voices lowered to whispers, their eyes darting toward the office where the manager sat with blinds drawn. None of them said it out loud, but all of them were waiting for the explosion that would follow once the truth finally hit him. For a short while, he walked around as though nothing had happened. He wore the same sharp suit, kept his jaw tight, and barked out the same orders. He acted like his outburst had solved something, like throwing a man out of his showroom had cemented his authority. But beneath that mask, his nerves betrayed him. His hands trembled when he signed paperwork. He snapped at small mistakes. His smile, on the rare occasion he forced one, didn't reach his eyes. He was trying to convince himself he was still in control. It didn't take long for the whispers to become facts. Calls started coming in. Quiet messages passed between employees who had connections outside, people who had heard the news before it hit the press. By midday, it was confirmed. The dealership had changed ownership weeks earlier, and the man the manager had humiliated, mocked, shouted at, thrown out in front of everyone, wasn't just a celebrity passing through. He was the new owner. The moment the staff heard, the atmosphere shifted again. Some tried to hide their relief behind nervous laughter. Others couldn't stop shaking their heads in disbelief. They had all seen it happen, had all been frozen in place while their boss destroyed himself without even knowing it. A few felt a strange sense of justice, as though the world had finally found a way to answer years of cruelty. But under that, there was also fear. If power could shift so quickly, none of them knew what it meant for their own jobs. The manager, when he finally realized, didn't show it in words at first. He shut himself in his office for hours, blinds still drawn, phone calls unanswered. The staff could hear the pacing, the occasional thud of his fist against the desk, the muffled curse words breaking through the silence. Pride had always been his armor, and now it was shattered. He had built his entire identity around being untouchable, and in one careless act, he had stripped that identity bare. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his eyes sunken. He tried to speak to the staff, to gather them in a circle and explain away what had happened, but his voice faltered. He called it a misunderstanding, a mix-up, and insisted he hadn't known, but his words carried no weight. Everyone had seen the rage in his face, the spit flying as he screamed, the contempt dripping from his tone. There was no misunderstanding. There was only humiliation, raw and undeniable. The emotional toll rippled outward. The receptionist, who had endured months of his sharp commands, felt a strange mix of pity and satisfaction. She watched him struggle to cling to authority and saw a man who suddenly looked small, fragile even. The salesman, who had long endured his humiliations, spoke to each other in hushed voices about what might happen now. Some hoped for change, for a new kind of leadership. Others worried about instability, about whether the dealership would survive the fallout. Outside those glass walls, the story spread fast. The media caught hold of it within days. Headlines painted the scene in bold strokes. Celebrity mogul insulted, humiliated, thrown out of his own business by a man too blind to see the truth. The public ate it up. Clips of the incident surfaced online, shaky phone recordings that captured the manager's voice rising, the moment the man turned calmly and left. Social media is flooded with commentary. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but almost everyone agreed. Arrogance had finally met its match. For the manager, the public shaming was worse than any private punishment. His name became attached to the story, and no matter how he tried to spin it, the image stuck. He was the man who had kicked out his own boss, the man who let his pride ruin him. Friends avoided his calls, business contacts distanced themselves, and even his family could see the cracks widening. At home, he grew restless, angry, and withdrawn. Arguments erupted over dinner, his temper spilling into spaces where once he had held control. His children looked at him differently, sensing the weakness he had always tried to hide. The dealership itself became a different place. Customers came not just to shop, but to glimpse the place where the infamous scene had unfolded. Some whispered as they walked the lot, pointing to the office where the shouting had taken place. Others openly asked about it, amused at the irony. The workers, though, carried a heavier weight. For them, the incident wasn't entertainment. It was the breaking point of years of control, and now they lived in the uncertainty of what would come next. The new owner didn't return right away. He let the silence linger, let the story grow until it filled every corner of the building and every line of conversation. And in that silence, the manager unraveled further. He tried denial, telling himself it wasn't as bad as people made it out to be. He tried justification, convincing himself he had only been protecting the showroom, that anyone would have done the same. But no matter what story he told himself, the truth always returned. He had lost everything because he couldn't control his pride. The staff saw it too. The once untouchable man now walked with slumped shoulders, his voice no longer carrying the same sharp authority. They watched him try to cling to dignity. But dignity doesn't survive long once it's been stripped in public. For them, it was proof that power was never as solid as it seemed. And for the community, the story became something larger than one man's downfall. It became a tale of arrogance meeting humility, of pride unraveling under its own weight. People who had never cared about the dealership suddenly had an opinion on it, repeating the story in bars, in barbershops, in offices. It wasn't just gossip. It was a lesson, repeated over and over. No matter how much power you think you hold, one wrong move can take it all away. In the quiet of his office, late at night, the manager sat alone. Papers piled on his desk, phone buzzing unanswered. He stared at the glass walls that once reflected his pride, and now only showed him his own hollow face. For the first time he felt the weight of what he had done, not as anger, but as loss. He had lost more than authority. He had lost respect, trust, and the illusion that he was untouchable. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal, emotional, human. And as the days turned into weeks and the whispers turned into hard truths, one thing became clear. The crime he committed wasn't against the man he threw out, it was against himself. In the weeks that followed, the dealership became less a place of business and more a monument to a single mistake. Customers still came, cars still sold, but the heart of the story lived in whispers and headlines, in the way people glanced at the office where it all began. The incident didn't just damage a man's reputation, it dismantled an entire power structure that had held the place together. For the manager, there was no recovery. The new owner's silence spoke louder than any direct punishment. He wasn't fired in a dramatic scene, nor was he dragged out for the world to see. Instead, he was left to wither under the weight of his own humiliation. His authority evaporated. His staff stopped fearing him, and every order he gave felt like an echo of a man already forgotten. In time, his resignation came not as a choice, but as an inevitability. He packed his office in silence, carrying boxes past the same workers he had once controlled, their eyes following him not with sympathy, but with the cold curiosity of people witnessing the fall of someone they thought untouchable. There were no legal consequences for what he had done, no crimes charged, no lawsuits filed. His downfall wasn't the work of courts, but of consequence itself. Reputation, trust, pride. Those were the currencies he had spent recklessly, and once gone, they could not be bought back. Justice didn't come in handcuffs. It came in silence, in shame, in the loss of everything he had once believed made him powerful. For the staff, the shift was both liberating and uncertain. They no longer worked under the daily fear of being humiliated, no longer felt the sting of his sharp voice cutting them down. Some found relief in that, even hoped that things might change under new leadership. But others carried scars too deep for quick healing. They had lived too long under control to shake it off easily, and even with the manager gone, they caught themselves looking over their shoulders, waiting for a voice that no longer called their names. The new owner eventually returned, not with fury, but with quiet purpose. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove anything. His presence alone was enough to reset the balance. He treated the staff differently, not as pawns, not as prey, but as people. That simple act, that quiet respect, reshaped the atmosphere more than any memo or meeting could. The glass walls, once reflections of control, now reflected possibility. But even as the dealership moved forward, the memory of what had happened remained etched into its foundation. For the wider world, the story became something more than local gossip. It was a parable, retold in headlines and conversations, a lesson in pride and blindness, People pointed to it as proof of how quickly arrogance can destroy a person, how one moment of unchecked temper can undo years of work. Some laughed at the irony, others shook their heads in disbelief, but beneath the amusement was recognition. Everyone knew some, unlike that manager, someone who built their power on intimidation, who believed themselves untouchable. And everyone knew how fragile that kind of power truly was. The societal impact was subtle but real. The story reminded people of the thin line between authority and abuse, of the way pride can warp into cruelty when left unchecked. It sparked discussions about leadership, what it should be, what it shouldn't. In workplaces far from that dealership, people brought it up as an example, a warning of what happens when control replaces respect. On a deeper level, the story touched the human core. It showed how quickly people can be consumed by their need for dominance, how arrogance blinds us to the simplest truths. The manager hadn't just failed to recognize a celebrity, he had failed to see a human being. To him, power meant control, and when he felt his control slipping, he lashed out. That act revealed the fragility of his entire identity. The themes at play were as old as humanity. Pride before the fall, the blindness of arrogance, the quiet endurance of those who suffer under it. Justice here wasn't about courts or laws. It was about balance, about the way the world has of leveling itself, of stripping away illusions when they become too heavy to carry. In the end, the story wasn't just about one man's mistake or one dealership's chaos. It was about human behavior itself, about the way pride can isolate us, the way fear can silence us, and the way truth, eventually, refuses to be ignored. The manager lost everything because he couldn't see beyond his own need for control. The staff gained a measure of freedom, but carried the scars of years under his rule. And the community walked away with a story that served as both entertainment and warning. The dealership still stands, cars still gleaming under glass, engines still waiting for the road. But for those who were there, the memory lingers. Every time the glass catches the sun, they remember the day pride shattered in front of them, the day silence spoke louder than shouting, the day power revealed itself for what it truly was, temporary, fragile, and human.